Hey, undeniably, life has a lot of challenges on an individual level. So, what I want to bring to you today is a few ideas which you might consider applying into your life and to be able to be beneficial towards you as they were to me. And if you hear those sirens, that means you have to watch the video. Okay. You can do whatever you want. But for the first point here, if you cling too hard on a rock, it crumbles. And with that, the rest of your life falls. So, to explain that, what I mean is if you center your ideology too specifically onto one thing and you essentially you cling too hard on the rock, you cling too hard on being a far left Democrat or far right Republican, or you cling too hard being a fan of North Korea, or you cling too hard on focusing calling people Nazis, that crumbles because obviously those ideas are usually fundamentally flawed to some extent. And then your rest of your life falls because you identified yourself as that thing and you started to assimilate your skills, your traits, and your attributes around that thing. So basically, it's now, sure, some people are going to call me mean here, but no one even watches this right now, anyways. But say, for instance, you are this pencil. Maybe you're one of those people that, oh, I identify as blah, 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 whatever. Okay. So that's great, right? You identify as one of the 52,000 genders that apparently exist. Don't care. That's not the point. The point is that if you center your life around the fact that you identify as something like that, or even something with more substance that everyone can see. Maybe for instance, you a reader, right? Someone who reads. So if you identify yourself with that and you center all of your actions and basis around just that individual thing, what's gonna happen is this. Because you're putting so much strength and tension of your life around this one thing of reading, it breaks. And then you simply are not able to handle the pressure when someone criticizes you since you have nowhere else to go. You boxed yourself in and you clung too hard onto the rock and it crumbles. Or the box shreds. Or whatever you want to call it, right? So that's something that I thought was interesting. And I wanted to share that with you so that you could see a different direction that you could put your life towards instead of just, I guess, being really focused and in one spot. Because some people can do that. Some people are capable of doing this. But in a sense, I feel as if there's ego that exists there, right? And this ego will make life a lot more difficult, as you can usually see with people who people who are lonely, or people who are isolated in certain locations all day and they don't receive any outside information and they just work with what they have in their mind. They develop a huge ego, and that thing usually boxes them in or makes them hug onto the rock. And you just get the idea that this self-centered developing of your own person around such a narrow thing, when there's too much in life for your brain to process, you don't at least try to reach out and grab these counteracting ideas so that you can actually individually grow your knowledge as a human being. So that is, if you cling too hard on a rock, it crumbles, and with that, the rest of your life falls. Now, the next point I make here is if you accept an average person's advice, won't you become average? Now, this one I really liked. This is a quote from Unscripted by MJ DeMarco, and I really like this idea because it just it really grasps an understanding of, I guess, a lot of different things. For instance, maybe something like politics, right? So, let's say we'll say the average IQ is like 100, right? It doesn't make sense in a second. So, if we'll say, here, you know what? Fuck it. We're just gonna, all right. So average IQ is 100, or like, we'll say, you know what? Yeah, I'll make this a little bit more fun. Average IQ is 70 to 100, right? And we're gonna say that, well, this is like a pretend example. And then we're gonna say that Joe Biden and Donald Trump are in there. And what's gonna happen is you're gonna get a cohort of people that simply follow one or the other idea strictly. And that goes back to the first point. But what really matters here is that you're accepting these people's advice, right? And now, maybe you can't say, oh, well, they're not average, though. Yes, but they're 80 years old. One can't walk up the stairs. The other one yells at people on Twitter for some reason. It's like, okay, whatever. I mean, no, it's not really that bad. Anyways, so it's like, okay, how are these people becoming presidents? Now, you can, obviously, if you lean from one side to the other, you're going to argue for competency. However, going off of just pure metric-based results that weren't exactly extrapolated towards one side or another, I would say that Trump was doing statistically better than Biden. I know there's going to be people out there going absolutely nuts if they watch this part, but it's a matter of the fact that perhaps we should be more open to the idea that we shouldn't be exactly so focused on a person and their ideologies after the fact, in post-mortem of whatever candidacy that they ran, but rather we should be focused on the statistical part post-mortem, right? Because maybe he's like an 83-year-old guy running rampant on Twitter, right? For whatever, right? That's his own thing. But you're seeing like we'll say, I think I'll to keep this like court cases of a certain Biden, just trying to, so if you get the idea. And it's like, okay, so now you're going to have the average competency people accepting these two ideas, and then as they accept these ideas, they're going to become hard locked in their mind to not be able to switch or at least look at the other side so they can actually develop their ideas and become a person who has some heightened knowledge to them that can actually provide something to the world in a sense. With that being said, I'll give you a second example now that makes a bit more sense. So, we'll say the average math teacher or average math professor, okay? Go to like an average community college. Well, how would you expect your knowledge to succeed that person without trying to receive extra knowledge outside of that thing, right? Your knowledge is always going to be under or equal to the person that is teaching you if you are not looking for other sources because you're just strictly absorbing from that source, right? It's the same idea as if you got your news off of CNN or Fox, right? It's all extrapolated, politicized machinery into two ideologies which appeal to a lot of people, obviously, because otherwise they wouldn't run. But you get that sort of development towards isolation instead of accepting other people's advice or accepting the right people's advice instead of the average people's. And therefore, you will be able to exceed beyond the average standard if you are to accept advice beyond the average people. That's why I believe that perhaps people like David Goggins and people who like watch their inspirational videos get really inspired by it because they are not at that level. And neither am I, right? I'm not saying I'm at his level, certainly not. But what I am saying, in a sense, is that people who expect to get a sort of high from like videos like that and expect to be on his level afterwards, it's like, well, no. You have to put in numerous years of experience plus numerous years of self-reflection which neither one of those you have. Therefore, do not extrapolate your identity to something else, right? This really goes on to the clinging too hard on a rock thing I mentioned earlier. Since now, if you're getting into the imaginary state, right, which is often what motivation and like positive emotions provide, and that's why ego exists, I think. So, if you get into that area and then you start to put yourself into clinging onto that thing, it's like, well, okay, now you're not even taking the action that requires you to put yourself into that shoe, right? Now you're really gonna crumble but anyways, if you agree to average people's advice, won't you just become average? Or accept, sorry, not agree. Because you can't agree with, let's make this distinguishment real quick. You can agree with people that are average, okay? Totally. If you agree with people that are average, that doesn't mean you're going to become average. Because a lot of times, average people's advice is good. Because, well, otherwise they wouldn't be average, right? Because I believe in order to be average, you have to at least, at minimum, have a 50-50 towards good or bad advice, right? Since that is what's believed to be average. But yet again, average is more of like 99 to 1, or rather, I wouldn't say that. I'd say like 70-30. It's more like 70-30. Like 70% of people are average, 30% of people are above average, but not into the extremes, right? Like, the Tates of the world, right? So, yeah, that's going to sum up. I was going to bring up something else, but I don't really know what I was going to talk about then, so I'm just going to end that one there. So that was, if you accept an average person's advice, won't you just become average? Now, this next one is, you cannot fear rejection because regret will hit catastrophically worse. Now, this, I'll put it into the example of, you know what? I'll put it into the example of war, all right? So let's say there are two men versus two other men in this one like zone, right? You could picture like a deserty zone with like some buildings and like maybe like a car. You could picture one of like Hollywood scenes if you like, right? And you could picture the two people of whatever side you are, and then the two people of whatever enemy side you are, okay? So now you are, we'll say you're a very accepting and nice person of other people, right? And you aren't exactly a fan of killing people, which, I mean, that would be a pretty fair assumption. However, you've been psychologically trained to be able to do such things, because obviously you're at war, and you've also been trained how to use a gun. So you can do it, you have the capability, but you probably don't want to. Like most people, they don't want to kill people, but like if they have to, they will, right? So what happens is, let's say these four people, they come together and they decide to make truce for right now, right? Just because it's just these four people. Remember, no one's watching, no one's by them. It's just these four people, and maybe they all understand the same language and they speak it. Maybe they understand French, right? Maybe they all speak French. Okay, so they all speak French and they go chill out for a bit, right? And now they decide, okay, I'm gonna go to sleep. And you'll see where I'm going with this in a second. I'm gonna go to sleep. All four go to sleep, but somebody else walks in. And since they see two people from other sides allying, maybe in their perspective they see, shoot, I have a good idea here. Can't fear rejection. Okay. And these people see these other people sleeping, right? Because they're on one of the sides, and they kill the people. Or, like, they kill one of them, right? And, like, they kidnap another person. So, now, as everyone's awake now, because they just shot somebody, now you have the idea where you cannot fear rejection because regret will hit catastrophically worse. Meaning, in this case, you cannot fear the rejection of other people, of other people's other people's perspective on you, and like try to be allies with them in a sense, because if somebody else walks in, right? I mean, obviously this is an if, but if somebody walks in and they kill that person, now you're going to be feeling pretty regretful because you just allowed your friend to die because you wanted to feel not a sense of rejection towards other people and have to fight them. So now, to bring this home, in a sense, we'll like literally bring it home, right? And the filter that you have with your parents. And this one I want to bring up because a lot of people, including myself, feel that they have to filter through something to their parents because they can't proclaim their true ideas towards them in fear of rejection of the idea. And what I want to say this is absolutely wrong. Because not only from my perspective, but from Jordan Peterson's perspective of being honest with yourself, and that requires you being honest with other people, and that requires you having honest communication with your parents, even if it isn't exactly the nicest, or even if they aren't the nicest to you. You have to have that honest communication, but you have to know how to communicate. Because a lot of people, including myself, don't know how to communicate. And if we learn this skill, I mean, in a sense, you could think about it as the war example. We could stop the war if you know how to communicate properly, right? If you know how to negotiate. Right. So, a great book for negotiation, by the way. Never Split the Difference, Chris Voss. Beautiful book on negotiation. And I actually used some of the tips to talk to one of my friends. And I'll give you this crazy story. So, I'll keep his name private, obviously. But one of my friends, they were talking about recent hardships they had with a relationship. And at first, they were kind of secluded off, which makes sense. It's a natural reaction, right? If you were in that situation, you would naturally close yourself off, and to the extent where you wouldn't really want to share any information. And so I used some of the techniques in there, like labeling, and I don't even, man, it was a while ago, so my brain's kind of foggy on this. But basically, for the labeling example, he would mention a paragraph of sorts. I'd read it, and there'd be one part where he says something like this, right, or make something broad. And what I would do is I'd text him back just that word that he used with a question mark. Labeling. I can't remember if it's labeling or mirroring, but it's labeling. And you label that thing with importance, because when you send them back the this or the that, or what do you mean by this? Well, no, I wouldn't say that, because that makes them go defensive, but you say this, question mark, and then they feel implied and obligated to explain that this, because otherwise they're not answering your question and they're just being a dickhead. Or otherwise they're just trying to reroute the conversation and you could tell they're lying to you, and that's also not good. So it triggers in the other person's mind to explain that thing, and they become more open to it because they clearly can see that you're listening to them, even if it's over text, because since you're labeling their idea, right, and you're sending it back to them, what you're basically saying is, I'm listening to you. However, I cannot provide you any mental, emotional, or physical comfort unless you provide me the details of what I just sent. Therefore, that is one way that you can seriously improve your communication skills is, or if you even just want to see like what the other person's perspective is, you can go, they'll say, oh, well, I don't really like the Democrats because they always think that climate change is some like bullshit thing. Okay, well, what do you mean by bullshit thing? Or like bullshit thing? That implies what I just said. So, to bring this back now to what this point is you cannot fear rejection of your ideas because regret will make you consistently worse, or catastrophically worse, sorry. And if maybe, for instance, I didn't have the communication skills, he would have regretted the idea of not being able to open up to me about this problem. Therefore, he would regret the idea that he wouldn't be able to bring emotional assistance with him from a friend, and that would carry on to his future. And because regret is always there after the present moment. After that one moment that you did that thing that you regretted, or maybe you didn't do that thing you regretted, because that's much more common, right? If you didn't do that thing and you regret it, that regret is going to be there for basically the rest of your life unless you can accept the fact that you made a mistake there. Because then if you can accept that fact, then you can go, okay, well, yeah, I made that mistake. I won't do it again. Boom. So with rejection, for instance, and we'll put it into the classic definition of like going into a relationship, right? If you get rejected, okay, so what? That maybe that tells you something about yourself, but at least you had the courage and the ability to go out and say, hey, this, and this. Hey, this, and this. And that carries on into more than just relationships, too. That carries on into business. That carries on to, like, relationships with your family. It carries everywhere. So being able to act on things and not have to have the regret bearing on you will seriously improve your self-confidence and yet humble you at the same time. And it's a really great tool to use, we'll say, for getting along in this chaotically, sometimes unbearable life. So that's going to conclude the point. You cannot fear rejection because regret will hit catastrophically worse. And the next point to bring up, the only place we can all reach at the same time is nowhere. Now, I don't want to credit this idea to myself because I believe it's been said before, but what I want to say about this is that the reason why I say this is because everybody has a desire, right? And some of the desires are more difficult than others. And so, therefore, it takes more time, especially if that person has a different type of skill. It takes more or less time for other people to reach their destinations. However, if they're not reaching their destination, if both people are not reaching their destination, that is a mutually agreeable fact that they are both going nowhere at the same time. Since nowhere would be defined as anything but the direction that they are wanting to go. Because essentially, right, if you're going on a road, if you're, like, imagine you're driving a car down the road, and you just break in the middle of the road, right? You're going nowhere, okay? And you certainly don't want to go backwards, because if you go backwards, that means you have to redo the progress that you just did, and no one wants to do that. So, and you don't really want to go left or right, because that's in the wrong direction. And unless you reroute yourself and you bring yourself back to where you need to go, then you're just making yourself more lost. So you want to make sure that you're going forward so that way you're not going nowhere. And in a sense, you're able to direct yourself towards a objectively defined goal or objectively defined purpose, I guess. And then it helps you structure your life in a way where you're not chaotically roaming around trying to figure out what things to do. So that's another idea that I like, since it helps you explain to yourself that going nowhere is not beneficial, but it also helps you understand that a lot of people are going nowhere at the same time instead of it just being you. But it doesn't give you the excuse to not go anywhere, right? Because then you end up like, well, the classic example is you end up like the fat Discord user who just sits and does nothing all day. Like, okay, obviously not very, very, very few people want to be that, okay? Or very, very few people actually become that thing. Since usually by that point they become conscious enough to say, hold on, this is not me. What the hell is going on here? Let me reroute, go that way, right? So I think that sums up my point there. And this will end the point of the only place we can all reach at the same time is nowhere. And this kind of brings up another point that I want to mention, which isn't written down here, but it is essentially my own idea, kind of, but not really. I'll explain it my own way, but the consciousness will, or You cannot escape your consciousness. And this one I really like because I'm a much more conscientious person, so like it relates to me. And this one, it explains the consciousness in a way where it shows you how unrelenting it can be at times. And so with that, you basically are unable to escape your consciousness is what it's saying, literally. And to apply this in a scenario, right? Maybe you're addicted to something, right? And you know you're addicted to something and you know how to solve it and you should solve it and you could solve it. Now your consciousness is going to say, hey, you aren't solving that addiction, you know. You aren't solving that addiction, you know. If every time you try to go do that thing. And it's really interesting because this is actually a self-adapting program, which basically says you're becoming worse and worse and worse and worse and worse as you do this thing and you keep going to do this thing, that eventually you're going to experience such a pain point that you're going to be like, fuck you, I'm going to the better version of me and I'm going into the better direction that I want to be and that I can be going and that I will be going. Then you really get to the point where you're like, well, okay, that addiction, out the fucking window. And you really learn how to quit addictions that way. Since, like, you don't need the classic 10 tips to quit smoking or the 10 tips to quit porn or the, you know, the basically the equivalent of like a David Goggins motivational video. You don't need that if you've experienced personally such a pain point where you're like, okay, that's fucking disgusting. I don't want to be this disgusting person anymore. I have so much more to life that I want to be. Fuck you, and fuck you, and I'm going this way, right? Usually people identify that in a sense, and that's what usually goes on in people's minds, and then, boom, addiction cleared. So, this is essentially saying, when you say that the consciousness cannot, or you cannot escape your consciousness, I always confuse that, I'm sorry. That really means that you have the capability to program yourself into the direction you want to be as long as you are consciously aware and repeating those thoughts in your mind. And this really becomes prevalent when you talk about the external absorption of information. And if we go back to that political thing that I made earlier about the whole thing from Fox and CNN, you absorb knowledge from one of the things, and then and then your mind never moves, and you get the idea that your consciousness can't escape you, or you can't. I always confuse it. You cannot escape your consciousness. Okay, remember that for me because I'm too stupid to say it. So you remember that idea, and you're like, well, clearly I'm taking in information from a biased source. Let me go try to find an unbiased source. And that doesn't mean like, okay, well, to neutralize it, you go over to CNN. Like, no, that's not what that means. What that means is that you actually go to a neutralized source, say fuck you to all the previous bullshit that you're going through and listening to, perhaps, and then analyzing for yourself what you think is the right thing. Because maybe a couple ideas from the Democrat side is correct, but they just aren't executed correctly, right? Like, maybe global warming is actually happening, okay? But the way that they're saying it and the way that they want us to bring a solution is completely ineffective because we don't have trillions of dollars. We're already trillions of dollars in debt. In addition, what happens after the utilization of the tools is done, right? What happens when a solar panel dies? Where does it go? Huh? You can't just like recycle it. You know what I'm saying? Oh well, you could go in your okay. What about the heavy metals that can't be used again? They're like buried in the fucking ground and they're in the soil. And what about the times they're actually being used? How they are damaging the soil in that current moment. So it's like the way that you're trying to counteract. Sorry, big honk. But the reason why you're trying to counteract this thing, or the way that you're applying it, is backwards because you're actually just damaging it more than you would have without that thing. And it's like, okay. So gaining that perspective might be an interesting one for you to look into if you like. But anyways, so that will sum up the point. because I was about to ramble on to some nonsense, so I'm just gonna cut it there. That will be the end of the point that you cannot escape your consciousness. And now, this one, which I learned recently, so I don't really know much about, but I'm gonna try to explain it to you in the best way that I can. Life is far too open to calculate for an optimal life or trade. Now, obviously, in a sense, you can kind of get a grasp of it with things like mental health, physical health, spiritual health, social health, and emotional health. You can get these things together and say, okay, well, let me get to the point where I can become really good at that thing. So that form of health improves, and the other ones don't, but they don't decrease either. And then you can kind of find these little things, and then sure, you can go and try to live the optimized life. But if you just strive to live an optimized life, that often means delaying gratification in a sense. Fair enough. But if you just simply do that, right? I remember watching a Chris Williamson podcast. There's a point where I can't remember what the quote was, but like it was something along the lines of, I'm going to be paraphrasing. The maximum delaying of gratification often just leads to no gratification. Since, let's say you think in a timeline of 70 years from now, okay? And we'll give you the reasonable factor that you're probably going to live to like 70 or 80, right? Or like 90. Because, I mean, like, with modern technology, you could basically live to like 100. Like reasonably, you can now live to 100. It's not like in the 1800s where you'd fucking walk outside and die of dysentery. Like, you walk outside and, like, it's not like pavement, which has its own benefits and downsides, obviously. But what I mean by, like, it's far too open to calculate for an optimal life is that, okay, you can calculate it in this sense, but what about this sense, right? And now you're getting a whole different set of actions, right? So we'll say, maybe you want to be a really, really good gymnast. Okay, well, maybe you don't need exactly social health, in a sense, but maybe you don't actually need either spiritual health either. Maybe you just need physical, mental, and emotional health to be able to just do the things, okay? And now you can say, oh, well, mental health is social health too. It's like, okay, whatever. But you get a totally different set of skills required to do that thing. And even like, okay, surfing. You get a whole different set of skills with surfing. So, to think of the idea of optimizing for your life, it's so broad, you can't actually specify it because there's so many things that one person could do, right? Not they can do, right? Because you can't do everything. We're not immortal. But there's so many options that a person could take that it becomes essentially, I believe, almost impossible to try to narrow down into a direction. Now, am I saying that we shouldn't? No. Because if we do find this answer, which in a sense we have, but if we find this ultimate answer, this ultimatum that comes thousands of years from now, then we can really get to the point of, okay, we are almost at the pinnacle of human life, right? And then we can really get the point of how do I improve my condition and my experience on this planet while I still have the time to live. And that's a really big fear that a lot of people have. I have it to an extent, right? I want to be wealthy and healthy and have a good relationship because with those things, obviously your life is benefited. And obviously with those things, you can cultivate a sense of satisfaction. And you can give to other people. And you can do the things that most people can't. And people get a lot of pride in that, which, whatever that may be. But you just, with that, you're able to openly experience life. And I think that freedom to do that is what everybody strives for, in a sense. Because no one likes to be restricted in a jail cell, right? No one likes to be imprisoned for a wrongdoing, like Malcolm X, for instance. Like, no one likes that. I mean, are they grateful for the opportunity? Sure. But it's like, if you ask them, where they want to be right now, they wouldn't really say jail unless they really felt like they needed like an experience that will humble them in the sense of where they can also increase their skills. Then maybe they would say jail. Maybe that would be a challenge for them. Okay, fair. So now you get to the point where you see these little things, right? And then multiply what I've just said and turn this video into 5 hours, and I still wouldn't be able to completely elaborate on how many little intricacies are connecting each individual person to the collective whole. So to wrap this point up now, this is going to be the end of life is far too open to calculate for an optimal life or trade. And that, my friends, is my few ideas that I wanted to bring to you that may help you and guide you in a certain direction in your life. So I'm glad that if you did watch this all the way through, and I hope that this provided some valuable information to you, as it did to me, since it brings you these creative insights that allow you to, in a sense, apply them and understand the openness, yet the focused practice of what life really is. And helps you understand it on an individual level and on a global level, and how certain things kind of play into certain factors that you can see and measure. However, there are a lot more things in the world that we can't measure. I mean, on a little bit of side tangent here, you don't have to watch this part, but like, even in terms of like radio waves, right? Or not radio waves, but in terms of like visible light, we can only see a very, very small fraction of light. There's like all of this, and we're seeing this. So it really shows the collective narrowness that we have, but it also shows the collective broadness that could be understood. So that's what I wanted to bring to you today, is the idea that life can be really broad and really focused depending on your personal actions to either a collective purpose or to your own purpose, and how do you want to develop that, right? Do you want to develop that in a way that's meaningful to you or expedient? Because this is a choice, by the way. Like, that's not something that's like, oh, well, I accidentally like became that person. It's like, no, you purposely became that person because of these actions. Oh, well, isn't that implying that I can change my life with my actions? Yes. That's exactly what it's implying. So, I'm going to wrap it up there, and I hope that you stuck with my boring-ass voice all the way through. If you did, thanks. Do the thingy now. You gotta go down and press the button because my broke ass. But no, just go down and press the button because, like, you know, why not? And hopefully these few ideas will help you understand something more about yourself. Man, what a long video. And as always, we're here to help you help them.